If you live in a neighborhood where there are no police and everybody has guns and lives in constant fear of attack, then there's going to be a lot of shooting. And that's the kind of neighborhood that all the countries of the world live in. There are no international police, so every country keeps itself armed and ready for violence. But the kind of violence that countries get involved in, they have a special name for. They call it war, and it now happens on a very grand scale indeed. During the last 2 years of the Second World War, over 1 million people were being killed each month. If the great powers go to war with each other just once more, using all the weapons they now have, 1 million people will be killed each minute. The fear of nuclear weapons can now bring people out by the thousands to protest against the fate that's being prepared for them. But relatively few people will accept the direct connection between the weapons they fear and the whole system of absolutely independent national states that makes them necessary. Bombs are bad, national independence is good. We spend our time attacking the symptoms of our problem, not the cause.
I come out here because I'm a believer, okay? And I am definitely opposed to increasing nuclear weapons because of my future, okay? I have 10 grandchildren, and believe me, I would like for the next 90 or 100 years that they enjoy that life.
Should the Soviet Union have nuclear weapons?
I don't think so.
Why not?
Почему нет?
Because if we seek peace, and all peoples seek peace, then the only way to go is for nuclear disarmament.
Do you worry about nuclear weapons?
I worry about war. A lot of people know that 70,000 died at Hiroshima, but very few people know that 225,000 died in Tokyo as a result of only 2 raids with conventional bombs. I was a bomber pilot a long time ago. I bombed Hamburg. 70,000 people died there when the air caught fire. 80,000 or so died at Dresden. And if you want to talk about numbers, 123,000 died at Iwo Jima. And they died at Lebanon, as you know, very recently. So the problem is war, not just nuclear war.
There'd be a case for saying that the people who lived before the First World War were in just the same condition. Things were going to happen that they would never have envisaged. So you can say more truly of the First World War than of the Second or of the Third, that if people had known, they wouldn't have done it. The Second World War, they knew more and they accepted it. The Third World War, alas, in a sense, they know everything about it. They know what will happen or is like to happen and yet do nothing. I don't know the answer.
We now have better machines, but we're not different from the past. Our world still works much the same way it did before World War I, so the result will probably also be the same. There was an arms race then too, especially in big important weapons like battleships. They were very expensive, the ultimate high-tech weapons of their time, like our nuclear missiles today. The nations counted each other's weapons with almost as much dread as we do, and raced to stay ahead. Every great power believed its safety lay in having as much military power as possible, and they all used their rivals' military spending to justify their own. We do the same, and like many people before 1914, we claim that being armed to the teeth makes war less likely. For a long time, the argument even seemed plausible. None of the great powers fought each other for 43 years before the First World War. We're now past the 40-year mark ourselves. Just like today, all the great industrial nations were divided into 2 opposing alliances. Though the actual lineup was different, that changes after every great war. And the alliances faced frequent crises, usually in obscure places. The crisis that finally toppled them into war started in the Balkans, where Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie were murdered by Serbian assassins. Austria declared war on Serbia, which was protected by Russia, and the alliances lumbered into action. In 1914, Tsar Nicholas of Russia spent weeks agonizing over whether to mobilize or not here at his summer palace, the Peterhof, near Leningrad. In some situations today, our leaders would have 30 minutes to decide on peace or war. The speed of thought has not increased since 1914, and even poor Nicholas didn't do very well.
Nobody was very decisive here in 1914. Even the generals were afraid of what might happen if they mobilized, but they felt they had to. The pressure on Nicholas was so great that he once actually agreed to general mobilization, only to cancel it again at the last moment. Everything possible must be done to save the peace, he said. I will not become responsible for a monstrous slaughter. But he was in charge, and a decision was expected of him. Russian interests had been challenged. On July the 30th, when the Chief of the General Staff was once again explaining how difficult the decision was, Nicholas finally lost patience. I will decide, he said, general mobilization, and left the room.
Mobilization meant that millions of reservists had to be called up and sent to the frontiers by train. And the railway timetables were so intricate that no one dared to stop the trains once they were in motion. Tsar Nicholas had half hoped that Russian mobilization would scare the other side into backing down. But of course they mobilized too. And the unstoppable trains delivered them all into a war that killed 8 million people.
In many ways, the world has not changed since 1914. The leaders and the weapons are different, but we still have war with us as the court of last resort, the ultimate way that disputes between nations get settled. And World War I has a curious echo for us. Then everyone believed that the military machine, once set in motion, could not be recalled. Now it's quite literally true. How do you call back a missile? But there's more to it than just that. All the conditions that led to the First World War are present now. The alliances, the arms race, the attitudes of nations as nations, the attitudes of their people. Even in an age of nuclear weapons, most people, if you ask them whether they'd fight for their country, will at least stop to think before saying no.
The 25,000 people who packed the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires in 1982 are celebrating an almost bloodless Argentine military triumph, the seizure of the Falkland Islands from Great Britain. In Britain, the response is a determination to show that nobody gets away with seizing British territory, even if most people aren't quite sure where that territory is.
A senior British official recently remarked that Britain's emotional maturity and political stability entitle it to be a nuclear power. He said it a few months after about half the British fleet sailed maturely out of this harbor to take back some barren islands 8,000 miles away that are of no real value to either Britain or Argentina. Britain might have behaved a bit more cautiously if Argentina had been a nuclear power too, but clearly the nationalist reflexes are still in good working order.
I feel so deeply and strongly that we have to regain the Falklands for British sovereignty. It is still British, it is still British, and the people still wish to be British and owe their allegiance to the Crown.
Stand up for freedom, stand up for democracy, that's what it's all about.
Are you expecting to do much fishing out there?
I hope so, yeah, I hope to.
What do you catch in the Falkland Islands?
I don't know. Argentinians, I think.
If they've gone to war with us, or they're being nasty, why shouldn't we be nasty back?
Almost 1,000 men, British and Argentine, died before Britain retook the Falklands. Fewer than 2,000 people lived there. But at the time, it seemed to be a matter of principle.
I'm neither British nor Argentine, but I must admit that at the time I felt the Argentines shouldn't be allowed to get away with military aggression. Taking territory by force, as Argentina did, undermines the fragile international order that keeps most of the world at peace most of the time. Trouble is, taking the same territory back by force, as Britain did, has exactly the same effect.
Who was really in the right is a matter of opinion, but any country strong enough to settle a dispute by force is likely to try.
After the first atomic bombs were dropped in 1945, people expected that nuclear weapons would bring a real change to the way international disputes were settled. But Albert Einstein knew better. Everything has changed, he said, except our way of thinking. The nuclear warheads that are programmed to kill this city will not drop straight down out of the sky as if some anonymous fate had sent them. They'll come skimming in at a very low angle from the north, from Russia. And the warheads that kill Russian cities will also come from a very specific direction, from us. Our danger does not come from the skies. It comes from ourselves and the way we run our world. We still believe, almost by reflex, that our countries are worth fighting for, and our governments go on acting as if their power and their prestige were the most important things in all eternity. They'd better be right, because eternity is now at stake. Any war is bad, but the general spasms of violence we now call world wars are far worse. 6 times in the past 3 centuries, all the great powers of the time have gone to war with each other. Now, though each war began with some particular crisis, what they were all really about was just national power. World wars are the way the present international system adjusts to the changing realities of power, as some countries gradually grow stronger over time and others decline. It's always been a crude and bloody system, but it used to work after a fashion. Now the game is up. One more round with today's weapons will kill all the players. So why do we pretend we can go on with the same international system we've always had? Mainly because the sovereign national state is the most powerful institution in our world, and we love it. Truth is, we love our countries too much for their own good, or for ours. These Canadians who fought in the First and Second World War all loved their country, and naturally they believed that the wars they fought in were just. Yet nobody now believes that the First World War was a struggle between justice and evil. Eventually the illusion fades, and we realize that our just war was really just about power, like all the others. But we can only afford to admit the truth when our veterans start to fade away, because we can't tell them that what they went through and what their friends died for was only power politics. I recognize a lot of the names here. They're common family names in Newfoundland. Pratt, Eyre, Chafe, Dunphy, names of friends I grew up with. The young men buried here must have been very like my friends, except they never got any older. They all died here on the morning of July the 1st, 1916. I've known about this patch of ground all my life. Everybody born in Newfoundland knows about it. It's in northern France near the village of Beaumont-Hamel. Well, that's how Newfoundlanders say it anyway. There's still not a lot of Newfoundlanders, and back in 1914, when the Great War came, there were only about 250,000 of us. But we raised a regiment of volunteers in 2 weeks and sent it off to fight for the Empire against the Germans. On the first day of the July drive in 1916, what we now call the Battle of the Somme, the Newfoundlanders were packed into this support trench here, which they had named St. John's Road. They weren't in the first wave of the attack, which started from the front-line trenches down there at 7:30. It was a hot and sunny day for a change, and they must have felt more and more nervous when the sound of the German machine gun fire didn't gradually die away as expected. At 9:15, the Newfoundlanders climbed out of this trench here. It must have been quite difficult, because each man was carrying about 70 pounds of equipment, and stood up into the machine gun fire. Someone who was there at the time said that they instinctively tucked their chins into their shoulders as though they were facing into a blizzard. They formed into lines, plodded off down this slope towards the German trenches just in front of that tree line there, and simply walked into eternity. Most of them were killed trying to get through the gaps in their own barbed wire, about halfway down to that clump of trees there, and the rest just kept walking until they were almost all shot down. None of them made it as far as the German wire. 801 Newfoundlanders went over the top here on the 1st of July. 68 answered the roll call the next morning.
You must have known that you weren't going to get through that wire. You knew that there were machine guns on the other side. What kept you going?
A good point, by gosh. I don't even know. We were ordered to go, we were supposed to take the German lines. Well, perhaps I was going to fight the German army. But I kept going, and if I hadn't got wounded, I'd have gone and tried to get through that barbed wire. I didn't seem to, I don't know whether it was the enormous amount of explosives, the shells, you know, from the artillery, but your feelings seemed to be sort of numbed in some way or other. All you knew, there was that chair, for instance, and you had to get to that chair come hell or high water.
You're dealing with excesses of love and hate. And among men who fight together, there is an intense love. And it is why people don't run. Because these are people who are close to you, they are in danger as you are in danger. And if you run, as the British say, you're letting the side down. If you stay, you may save them. And of course, they may save you.
War and combat, for all its death and destruction, and what man is capable of doing to man, for me, I can't speak for everyone, but for me, it was the first time I felt like that I was alive. I could feel the air, I could feel the sun, I could feel everything about me. I could even feel the jungle, the rice paddies, the mud, the water, everything. I could feel it. Do I think I ought to have learned it? At 19? No. But there at the time, yes. I had to learn it in order to survive. That's the name of the game. Fighting for country and mom and apple pie is fine when you're back here, but when you're out there, you're living by the heartbeat. You don't worry about the next day, you worry about the next heartbeat.
I felt that all the boys that were killed, that they were helping. That it might be the war to end all wars, but what good has it done? Richard he just got out of school, and the night that he had to leave, some of his friends had a party for him, and he came home. My brother was taking him into the train, and he just kicked me on the nose like that, and he said, "Mom, no tears." That's the last I saw.
Those who were left behind struggled to understand what it was all about. But the unlucky few who ended up in the worst parts of our wars know. They sometimes get impatient with the rest of us, and you can't blame them. We talk about peace and justice, but we're also determined to get our way as a nation. They have to die so we can get it.
The hatred is for people who are not in your situation. There is, of course, there is hatred of the enemy, though, as I say, that is not as intense. as the hatred of people who are safe at home. See, I think Frank Sinatra was the most hated man of World War II, much more than Hitler, because we in the Pacific had seen no women at all for 2 years. And there were photographs of Sinatra being surrounded by all these enthusiastic girls.
Increasingly since 1945, I've gotten annoyed at the sort of self-righteousness of many of my liberal friends who were not in the war, and who, if in the war, were not in the infantry, and if in the infantry didn't have their legs shot almost off. I get annoyed at their attitude of sort of self-righteous public shame about the atomic bomb. It was the bomb that ended the war. It was the bomb that saved my life. I certainly would have been destroyed invading Honshu or Kyushu, as I was scheduled to do. I say I would have been destroyed because by that time I'd lost my nerve. And if you lose your nerve, you're not very good as a soldier. And I think I would have just lain down and been killed, actually, after a while. So it did save my life. And as I said in something I once wrote about this, when the news of the first bomb reached the staging camp I was in France, where we were all assembled ready to be shipped to the Pacific, the camp burst out in cheers, and we cried. I cried now, when I think of it. We literally hugged each other for the first time in all the time we'd been in the Army. We abandoned immediately all of our sort of embarrassment about touching another man. We hugged each other, we crowded each other's shoulders because we knew that we were going to grow up.
Don't ask me that anything in warfare is right. I don't believe it's right to hit a man in the nose and make his nose bleed. But after all, if he's offensive enough, you hit him in the nose, or anywhere else you can hit him in order to stop him. The same applies to nations.
At any given time, there are around 20 wars going on in the world, and they are almost all due to the fact that somebody couldn't get what he wanted any other way. In Eritrea, in East Africa, what the people want is their own independent country. But the old colonial borders put them inside Ethiopia, so they had to fight for it. They've been fighting for a quarter century now. The Polisario guerrillas have a similar goal, the independence of Western Sahara. And they've been fighting Morocco for 10 years. If universal peace broke out tomorrow, they'd lose forever. They'll never get what they want except by force. Unless the Polisario guerrillas win their war, their families will spend the rest of their lives in these refugee camps. If we abolished war, we would in effect be taking a snapshot of the present and freezing it. Wars change things, and there are still a lot of people who want change. Take your snapshot in 1975, and Rhodesia would still be ruled by a white minority government. There would be no Zimbabwe. If the world had outlawed war in 1775, there would be no United States. Peace would have a very large hidden price. The world's borders have mostly been defined by wars, and it's only after they've won that people want to freeze them. Most Israelis, for example, would not want war to have been abolished forever in 1966.
During the Six-Day War of 1967, Israeli paratroops fought their way through this gate here and conquered the old city of Jerusalem. Israel promptly annexed it, and the question of who owns Jerusalem was settled once and for all. It was the 37th time that somebody had conquered Jerusalem once and for all. Wars do settle things, of course. Ask the Arabs of old Jerusalem, who now live under Israeli rule. But wars only settle things temporarily until somebody stronger comes along.
And somebody stronger almost always does come along eventually. The Israelis are still winning at the moment, and they'd like to stay on top. They'd certainly like war to be outlawed now. But you can't expect Palestinians to feel the same way. Traditional kinds of wars like these have killed an average of 40,000 people a month since 1945, but for all the pain and loss they cause, they're not bad enough to make people think about changing the whole way we run our world. For that, we needed the world wars. The Second World War was so bad it even scared the winners. At least 40 million dead, much of Europe and Asia in ruins, and nuclear weapons by the end. Something had to be done to prevent that, or worse, from happening again. So the victors created the United Nations. It ran contrary to all their instincts and traditions to recognize any higher authority than the national state, but it had become a question of sheer survival.
The world's people collaborated in the drafting of a workable international constitution.
The world's people had very little to do with it. The UN was designed as a survival shelter for the world's governments, and especially for the great powers themselves. If they could have stayed united, the 5 great powers on the Security Council really could have imposed a kind of peace on the world, but the habit of being completely independent proved very hard to break.
Well, there are 2 possibilities, it seems to me. The first one is that we run into another global disaster, which doubtless, if there's anything left, will finally change people's minds about the benefits of unlimited national sovereignty. And I sincerely hope that doesn't happen. I don't think necessarily it should. The second alternative is something much more gradual and slower, which is to convince governments that just as they have given up sovereignty in certain specialized fields, like, for example, radio frequencies or postal systems or something like that, that in the political field also they have to do this.
We can do it the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. But one way or another, the world is going to be politically united within the next 50 to 500 years. The exact time scale doesn't matter. It may get destroyed in the process, the unity of the mass grave, but it is going to happen. The process has already been underway for several centuries. The first truly intercontinental empires appeared in the 16th century, and by the 19th century we already had a fairly unified world economy. In terms of travel time, the entire planet today is smaller than France was 200 years ago. The relatively recent phenomenon of world wars is also part of the process. The interests and the fears of the great powers are now so closely intertwined that any war between great powers tends to spread until it involves all the others. The Second World War began in 1939 as a conflict between Britain, France, and Germany, but inside of 30 months it had dragged in countries as far away as Japan and the United States. National governments are bound to resist the trend towards a politically united world because it would inevitably diminish their own power. But most governments are run by intelligent people, and the horrendous cost of the world wars produced by the present international system has driven even governments to think in terms of setting up some world authority to settle their quarrels peacefully. They began trying after the First World War with the League of Nations. That didn't work, and therefore we had the Second World War. So when the victorious great powers made a second attempt to create a world authority in 1945, the United Nations, they gave it the right to enforce its decisions and gave themselves controlling shares.
On the surface, the slogan for the new UN could have been one for all and all for one. The idea was formally known as collective security. If one nation attacked another, then all the other UN members would come to the aid of the nation under attack. But the real rules the Charter writers devised made it unlikely that this would actually happen very often. because the 5 major powers of the world all reserved the right to say no.
The first test of collective security came in 1950, when war broke out in Korea. But the 5 great powers who were supposed to run the world had already broken up into 2 hostile blocs, as the winners usually do after a great war, simply because they're each other's biggest surviving rivals. A UN force was sent to Korea, but it was really just the U.S. Army and its allies under the UN flag. It only happened at all because the Russians had walked out of the Security Council at the time and were not there to use their veto. They never made that mistake again, and since Korea, one or another of the great powers has vetoed every proposal to impose a UN decision by force.
I also have always felt that one has to see the United Nations in a very long perspective. It's no good assuming it's going to work in the first generation. It's not. But I see it as a great human experiment in its very early stages, and if we can make tiny progress on 1 or 2 things each year, it's already something. But I don't imagine that in my lifetime it's going to ever reach up to the aspirations which people who don't know about politics have for it.
Collective security is dead, and even in peacekeeping, the UN has to wait to be asked in. Don't call us, we'll call you. Occasionally, some small country gets so desperate it does send for a UN peacekeeping force, as here in Cyprus. And if the great powers don't object, the operation can go ahead. But nobody is ever going to peacekeep on the territory of a great power, and even smaller countries would generally rather settle their disputes privately, by war if necessary. Since the United Nations first met in 1946, there have been at least 75 wars in the world. The first Arab-Israeli War, the first Vietnam War, the Korean War, the first India-Pakistan War, the second Arab-Israeli War, the Algerian War, the Sino-Indian War, the second Vietnam War, the second India-Pakistan War, the third Arab-Israeli War, the third India-Pakistan War, the invasion of Cyprus, the fourth Arab-Israeli War.
Actually, curiously enough, the United Nations, if everybody is frightened enough, it does tend to be extremely useful and quite effective. And particularly that is the case when you have the seeds of a superpower nuclear confrontation.
Not content with the destruction of Cuban independence, not content with the extension of Soviet power into the Western Hemisphere, not content with a challenge to the inter-American system and to the United Nations Charter, has decided to transform Cuba into a base for communist aggression, into a base for putting all of the Americas under the nuclear gun.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has yet come to nuclear war. As American UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson spoke, land-based missiles in Europe and the United States were on alert, ready to be launched at the Soviet Union. American and Soviet bombers carrying nuclear warheads were in the air, and Polaris submarines took up station off the Soviet coast. By putting missiles in Cuba, the Soviet Union had challenged America's nuclear superiority, and all the old responses to a challenge to national power came into play.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort.
It was the same old game. The United States had a huge superiority in nuclear weapons and didn't want to lose it. The Soviet Union felt strategically naked and was trying to narrow the gap by sneaking missiles into Cuba. But the U.S. slapped a naval blockade on Cuba, and the Soviet Union managed to back down behind a facade of bluster at the UN.
All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no. Я не нахожусь в американском суде.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
The world was not blown up in the Cuban crisis, of course. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev pulled his missiles out of Cuba, and both sides managed to back away from the brink of war with perfect dignity. They did it mostly by pretending to accept the UN's authority. They've done the same thing over Suez and Hungary in 1956, over the Middle East in 1973, and in a number of other crises.
The United Nations hasn't brought perfect peace and harmony to the world, but as a survival shelter against the next world war, it hasn't done that badly. If something like it had existed in 1914, maybe Tsar Nicholas would have been able to back out of the First World War. The great powers ignore it whenever they can, but when they need it more than anybody else.
I don't know what the answer is. I think we have to go on trying to prevent the worst from happening. As Hammarskjöld once said, the United Nations was not set up to bring mankind to heaven, but to save it from hell.
Even arms control is something the great powers would rather keep out of UN hands and settle among themselves. The first agreement they made was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, soon after they'd thoroughly scared themselves during the Cuban crisis. But it only prohibited atmospheric tests, and since then there have been close to 900 nuclear tests underground. After all, without some kind of test, you couldn't develop new weapons. In 1972, the superpowers actually agreed to control the number of their weapons by the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. But the word limitation was used in a rather special sense. The limits the treaty set were only limits on future growth and allowed the number of nuclear warheads to double in the following decade. The two sides now have about 50,000 nuclear weapons. In 1979, the Americans and the Russians came up with another arms control agreement. It was good public relations for both sides, but détente was breaking down by now, so the treaty didn't get ratified in the end. Besides, neither side is really willing to bargain away the key weapons that it pins its hopes of strategic superiority on. The U.S. wouldn't include multiple warheads in the SALT I agreement. The Soviet Union wouldn't get rid of its huge land-based missiles in SALT II, and the U.S. won't make a deal about Star Wars in the current negotiations. Our institutions, both our national governments and the United Nations, are failing to deliver the necessary assurances that they can guarantee peace, and people know enough about nuclear war to be very frightened. As a result, the past few decades have seen the emergence of a new phenomenon in the West, a peace movement with a mass following. Its strength waxes and wanes as the fear of imminent war rises and falls, but it's now a permanent political reality in every Western country.
I can't believe that the UN and all the people running it and all the governments could ignore something like this. And I think this one has everybody's heart in it. And the masses, how could they be ignored? I don't see how. Pray to God that I'm saying that it's the truth from my lips into God's ears.
Right? Look at him. Take a picture of him. Look at him.
What about him?
He's got a communist thing on his front of him, and he's knocking the American flag. I fought for this country.
Primitive nationalism is not the only argument the peace movement faces, however. It must also contend with some very sophisticated nationalism, which argues that the countries of the world can continue to do business in the old ways despite nuclear weapons. No painful sacrifices of national independence to some alien international authority are needed. The nation can still defend its own interests by military force if necessary, while avoiding nuclear war by deterrence. The peace movement is on the wrong track, they say. Even if deterrence should fail, which of course it won't, there's always Star Wars. President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative is a classic American attempt to solve a political problem with technology. As sheer technological escapism, it's quite wonderful, a real-life video arcade. But of course it isn't really just defensive. If the United States ever actually got an even partially effective defense against Soviet missiles, it would be freer to threaten Moscow with its own nuclear weapons.
So long as the United States, its allies, want to deter a war without having powerful armies to match the Soviet army, they must do so by relying on nuclear weapons, whether they'll say so or not, like it or not. And when you rely on nuclear weapons, you have to have a qualitative advantage or a numerical advantage. And so all the armaments developments can be traced back, whether it is Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative today, where it was the introduction of the first battlefield nuclear weapons 30 years ago, all traces back to this attempt to maintain a balance by adding nuclear weapons in along with the inadequate ground forces to match the Soviet army.
But the real issue with Star Wars is not whether it'll work well enough to frighten the Russians. It's whether it can convince ordinary people on our own side that their leaders have things under control. And just as people's faith in the ability of deterrence and nuclear weapons to keep them safe forever was wearing thin, surprise, they're offered a whole new technology of space defenses to stop the enemy from hurting them. Whatever the technological doubts about Star Wars, psychologically it's brilliant. If people will just go along with the existing strategies and weapons for the time being, it promises, then they can have a really safe system of defense sometime in the future. Keep calm and keep quiet. We do have things under control. You will be safe from nuclear war eventually. In military terms, it's childish because all air and space defense works by attrition. Some portion of the attacking weapons will get through any defense, and if they're nuclear weapons, even a very small fraction is far too many. President Eisenhower, who'd been a professional soldier all his life, explained the grim and permanent realities of our situation to the United Nations over 30 years ago.
Let no one think that the expenditure of vast sums for weapons and systems of defense can guarantee absolute safety for the cities and citizens of any nation. The awful arithmetic of the atomic bomb does not permit of any such easy solution. Even against the most powerful defense, an aggressor in possession of the effective minimum number of atomic bombs for a surprise attack could probably place a sufficient number of his bombs on the chosen targets to cause hideous damage.
Star Wars has been a great popular success, but the political need for it demonstrates the underlying strength of the peace movement, whose doubts about the credibility of any military defense policy in the nuclear age were becoming embarrassingly difficult to answer. But the case should not be overstated. The Star Wars project did not save the U.S. government from an irresistible political demand for disarmament. The American people's genuine fear of the enemy, the Soviet Union, is far too strong for that.
The hard question Western disarmers can never answer is, where are your equivalents in the Soviet Union? After all, the question goes, if there's no pressure for change here, how can you expect the West to change? Well, there is protest in the Soviet Union. There's an official Soviet peace committee with some 80 million members, and it holds rallies and marches like this all the time. But its efforts are directed solely against Western nuclear weapons. The system works differently here. What makes the Soviet peace movement different from Western peace movements is its official status.
The Soviet Peace Committee's policies are those of the Soviet government, which regards its own missiles as defensive and peace-loving.
We who are here from many countries will be able to tell the world that the citizens of Moscow gathered here today pledge themselves, as always, for peace, for the peace program of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, for the peace initiatives of the Soviet Union. Moscow is for peace. The peace movement is stronger today than at any time before.
Движение сторонников мира сегодня сильно, как никогда.
This is all pretty sorry stuff. A peace rally by invitation only, where an audience selected by the government listens to speakers telling them that the arms race is all the other side's fault. But Western governments say exactly the same thing, even though they don't hold peace rallies.
Western peace marchers look pretty impressive, but the story of disarmament in the West hasn't been exactly a success story either. And there is a reason for this. Most people do want peace. It's really a motherhood issue. Probably nobody wants peace more than the Russians. They still remember their 20 million dead from the last World War. But everybody's also caught up with the idea of security, the need to protect against what others, the enemy, might do to them.
The Soviet and American governments try to make themselves secure by aiming nuclear weapons at each other's citizens. The Soviets say that their missiles are peace-loving. America's Strategic Air Command claims that peace is our profession. But a nuclear warhead will still kill these people, even if you call it a rosebud. Russian and American citizens are fellow prisoners, held hostage by ways of thinking about national interests and how you protect them that are obsolete and lethal in a world where total war means exactly what it says. Maybe there's no better way, in which case we will, sooner or later, go into the cold and the dark of a nuclear winter. Certainly our governments have found no way of changing the system, but then they are the system.
No government's going to surrender power to the UN unless it absolutely has to. And since disarmament necessarily involves handing over real power to some higher authority so it can protect you, governments are not going to disarm voluntarily either. They understand very clearly that arms and national independence are inseparable. And frankly, the peace movement's not likely to force governments into disarmament anytime soon. For one thing, it's not just governments that would hate a UN with real power. Lots of ordinary people would too. Conflict's not going to disappear from the world, and a powerful UN would have to make decisions and impose them on individual countries. Every time we create a new layer of government, we create a new set of constraints to chafe against. But as Sherlock Holmes used to say, when you've eliminated all the impossible solutions for a problem, what you're left with, however unlikely, is the answer. And the only answer to our problem is the UN. The longer the great powers stall on handing their sovereign right to defend themselves over to the United Nations, as they all agreed to do in 1945, the greater the danger that we'll run out of luck and have a nuclear war. That is so great an incentive to change that even the unlikeliest solutions can become acceptable in the long run. We have to survive the short run to get to the long run, and any restraint that ordinary citizens can impose on their government's natural tendency to arm themselves to the teeth and beyond is certainly a help. But the real significance of the peace movement is that it shows the changes of attitude which will be necessary before a world authority becomes acceptable are already underway. Our horizons are gradually changing. We're moving beyond the old tribal definitions of humanity, where anybody who didn't belong to our tribe was an enemy. And we're beginning to see that even foreigners have rights that should be respected, and that they mustn't be killed when we quarrel. We're also getting more doubtful about sacrificing the lives of our own children for the state. It takes a long time for whole cultures to change their minds like this, and not all cultures are changing at the same rate. But eventually it can have real political effects. Do you really think that ordinary individuals, even acting together, can make a change in the way things work in terms of weapons?
Almost definitely. It was individuals, after all, that got us to the point that we are now, and certainly we are the resource to get us out of it. But we have to communicate, and we have to be honest with each other, and we have to establish our priorities. I choose life.
I think a united effort is needed by all those who clearly understand the dangers of war. What we need is for all peace-loving peoples of all countries, both socialists and capitalists, who unfortunately confront us, to be for total disarmament. It's absolutely clear.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
До свидания.
До свидания.
I wonder if you...
Lord Philip Noel Baker, Nobel Peace Prize winner and peace activist for over 70 years.
Well, the militarists say, if you want peace, prepare for war. An ancient Roman adage. It's nonsense. The whole of history has proved it's wrong. If you want peace, you must prepare for peace. The militarists say it is sweet and honorable to die for your country. What we say is that you must live for your country. It is sweet and honorable to give to your country the same dedication, the same service, the same devotion, the same self-sacrifice that a soldier gives in war. War can call forth the noblest instincts of young men, but it wastes them. It kills the young men. Their names are remembered for a short time, scratched up on a wall, and then forgotten. And they and their high ideals and their self-sacrifice have gone into history for no result, except almost certainly that their war leads the way to new wars later on.
If one really thinks about that, one has to assume that sooner or later humanity is going to be smart enough to devise political institutions which will guard against that happening again. And that is the reason why, however deficient in many ways the United Nations may be, I think it's an absolutely essential organization. There is no way in which this effort can not be made. It has to be made, knowing perfectly well that you're pushing an enormous boulder up a very steep hill. There will be slips and it'll come back on you from time to time, but you have to go on pushing, because if you don't do that, you simply give in to the notion that you're going to go into a global war again at some point, this time with nuclear weapons.
The world will not finally be safe from war until its countries have created a higher authority that can protect them from each other. So in the end, governments will have to give up much of their sacred independence. That means we have to give up some beliefs and attitudes that we hold very dear. We have to accept that although we love our country, because we love our country, we must not try to defend its rights by war. There's nothing honorable about fighting for what you believe in if it causes the destruction of the world. There's a long way to go, and we may not have a lot of time left. Either we abolish war, or sooner or later it will abolish us. But if we can understand how we have to change, and accept the cost of changing, then we can still have a future.